Our speaker today is Tara Felix. She is an assistant professor of beef cattle nutrition and management in the Department of Animal Science at Penn State University. She is a member of the livestock extension team and the Penn State Extension beef specialist. Dr. Felix advises undergraduate and graduate students in the Department of Animal Science and teaches courses in nutrition and cattle management topics. Her research centers around ruminal metabolism and nutrition and management of beef cattle. So with that, I would like to introduce Tara Felix, and you should feel free to share your screen.
Wonderful. Thank you for that introduction, Rich. Happy to be here today and see we have a number of folks coming in, so I appreciate your attendance. As Rich said, feel free to type any questions that you have into the chat, and if they're pertinent to a particular slide we're on, we'll get right to those. If they're questions that can wait till the end, we'll leave time at the end for those discussions. So this morning I was asked to discuss the topic of managing growing cattle during the winter feeding period. And I think there are some challenges in discussing this topic. And one of the things that I always share with producers when I speak in Pennsylvania is, we're really blessed when we talk about beef cattle and the beef industry. Our industry is fairly unique as an animal ag industry in that beef cattle can really utilize a wide variety of feedstuffs. And so as we think about managing growing cattle during the winter feed period, I want us to keep in mind that there are a lot of options and opportunities for us as beef cattle producers in doing so. So with that in mind, I was asked to talk to you about 4 different topics. So I am going to do my best to try and follow an outline. I'm usually pretty bad at following an outline, but today we're going to try. Those topics were growth curves and daily benchmarks for cattle during the winter feeding period, management strategies for harsh environments, which we won't talk a lot about. We're just going to talk about how it relates to the nutritional management of those calves because we're focused on the winter feed period. Grouping strategies for cattle, and then the nutritional information and recommended rations during that period. So again, keep in mind, we're discussing all of these topics with an emphasis on growing cattle during the winter feeding period. So let's start with the first topic, growth curve and daily benchmarks. The question that I always get is, what should our average daily gains look like in growing cattle? And this could be applicable whether it's a winter feeding period or whether it's growing cattle during another point in the year. I want to emphasize that we're focused on that winter feed period because for most of us in a spring calving system, we're weaning those calves right before that winter feed period, right? And so we're talking about those calves directly post-weaning. And when I get this question, what should my average daily gains look like in those growing cattle? I typically give the university answer. And any of you that have spent any time around or in university or with university extension programs know the university answer is always it depends. And that's a little bit tongue in cheek, right? But it depends because there are, as I mentioned, so many options and opportunities in feeding and choosing what to feed those animals. So your growth and daily benchmarks should depend first and foremost on the goals of your operation. The goals of your operation are going to depend on what your market is for those calves. Where are you taking these calves after the winter feed period? Are you maintaining those calves at the home farm to take them all the way till finish? Or is your plan to sell those calves when markets uptick in the spring? So the first thing you absolutely have to do before you start talking about what your growth and daily benchmark should be is define a goal for the operation. And sometimes this is one of the hardest things to do. When we sit around the kitchen table and we start to really think about what do we want to be as a beef operation, that can be one of the most challenging things. And I will just say, we'll talk a little bit about those goals as we go on, but one of the things that I always start with is it should make economic sense, okay? Your goals for your operation should first and foremost make economic sense. None of us got into the beef cattle business in order to get rich, but we also didn't get into it to lose money. And so that should be your primary goal. Second, when we're thinking about growth and daily benchmarks, we have to think about the feedstuffs that we have available. We're going to talk a lot more about nutritional recommendations as we go along. But before we can determine growth and daily benchmarks, we have to determine if we have the feeds available in order to meet those benchmarks. And again, we'll talk specifically about that a little bit later. As we're pushing that pencil, one of the things we need to ask ourselves is, what is the cost of gain for those cattle? And is that cost of gain going to pay out based on point one, my market for those calves? And last but certainly not least, we have to think about, if we aren't raising these calves from the home farm, if we're not bringing them up from our own weaned calves, where are we bringing them from? What kind of a situation are we bringing those calves out of? Have they been introduced to feeds before? And where do we want them to go? Are they going into a feedlot market? In which case, we probably don't want them to gain 6 pounds a day, because the feedlot won't want a calf that's fat and dumpy at 1,100 pounds, right? So what are we bringing these calves out of? What's our starting point, essentially, and where are they going? And again, that speaks to the market and the goals for the operation. So as we start to think through those different strategies, as we start to think through our goals, we begin to realize that nutrition is going to really dictate a lot of those benchmarks and in those growing cattle. And the primary thing that we have to realize about reaching those specific daily benchmarks or growth benchmarks that we might have for the overall feeding period is that we have to realize that every single bite of feed that animal is going to take is used in a hierarchy within the animal's body. We call this the hierarchy of nutrient use, and it's not unique to cattle. It's in every animal. But that hierarchy of nutrient use states very clearly that absolutely first and foremost, nutrients that animal takes in are going to be used to maintain self. That is the most critical thing to the animal, maintaining self. Next, within that hierarchy, that animal will develop in terms of reaching puberty, in terms of structural systems, bone development. Then that animal will grow, will apply lean tissue growth, will elongate those long bones, and nutrients will go towards growth. Many of you have probably seen what happens to an animal that is stunted if it doesn't make it all the way to that third bullet to growth. I have a little cat here at home that I rescued from a feedlot when I was in grad school, and we call her our pocket kitten, because she literally was surviving, I think, on corn silage when we got her. Of course, she had the classic rickets, and she's very, very small. Her long bones never grew because she didn't have enough nutrient intake early in life to make it through maintenance and development, let alone growth, right? So she's been stunted forever because of that. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time, because we're talking about feeding growing cattle. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the reproductive herd. But if we were focused on developing heifers, for instance, that hierarchy of nutrient use, then after growth, that animal would provide for, or if it was a mature cow, that animal would provide for the calf at side, right? Maintain self, then maintain young. So lactation would be the next nutrient depot in that hierarchy. After lactation, then would be reproduction. If we have enough nutrients in order to maintain self and in order to maintain the calf that we already have at side, a mature cow will then excuse me, be able to rebreed. That's one of the reasons we focus so heavily when we talk about cow nutrition on nutrient use right after parturition. And last but not least, if we have enough nutrients for everything else, then the excess nutrients, if you want to call them that, will go to fattening. And that becomes very important as we talk about feedlot cattle, not necessarily these growing cattle during the winter period, younger calves, but more those calves as they get on towards finishing. So this hierarchy will iterate over and over again, because it's critical to every other thought that we put towards feeding those animals during the winter feeding period. So if you want to think of that hierarchy more as a picture, you can think of it as the growth curve of those animals over time. And this slide I've used in animal nutrition classes and in extension presentations for years. It's very, very simple. It doesn't define growth units or time units, so it's a little bit vague, but it simply shows the standard growth of animals throughout their life, from birth to maturity. And what we're focusing on, and why I put this slide up, is that we're specifically focusing on that winter feeding period. And again, that winter feeding period for most calves coming out of a spring calving system is going to be early post-weaning growth, okay? And so I've highlighted on this growth curve what that trajectory of early post-weaning growth looks like. And what you'll notice is particularly lean tissue accretion. By that point, there's still some bone growth and development taking place, but the area of tremendous growth, because we've reached maintenance, we've gotten development pretty much under control, and the area of the most tremendous growth at that point is in muscle deposition and in lean tissue accretion. And so we're really starting to add frame and bulk to that animal in this early post-weaning period. And we do that in a nearly linear fashion, okay? And that's what I really want you to take home here, is that growth is very rapid and happens in a nearly linear fashion. Because of that, when we think about our average daily gain and feed efficiency benchmarks, those benchmarks that we usually use to monitor success of an operation, if you will, we want a really high average daily gain a lot of times because we want to maximize the efficiency of animals. Well, in those young, rapidly growing animals, those animals are extremely efficient. So the bottom graph on this slide shows you the pounds of feed that's necessary to put into an animal in order to achieve 1 pound of average daily gain. That's what we call feed efficiency. And that feed efficiency in a 4-weight animal, it takes about 4 pounds of feed in order to achieve a pound of gain. In a 6-weight animal, about 6 pounds of feed to achieve a pound of gain. And the numbers increase from there. Now, these feed efficiency and average daily gain benchmarks are great, but they're going to depend highly on the environment and the nutrients that we're putting into that animal because of that hierarchy, right? So the main take-home point with providing this slide is to say, animals are going to be most efficient early on, and then you have some control there over how rapidly you want them to grow. Perhaps you're developing heifers and you don't want that, or bulls, and you don't want them to gain 4 or 5 pounds a day, right? Then you can alter that with the diet, as we're going to discuss later. So this early post-weaning growth is tremendously efficient and it's tremendously rapid. But maintenance is still going to be the #1 depot for nutrient use, and the animal is still always going to choose to eat to meet its maintenance requirements first. So let's think about that when we talk about environment, right? And managing those cattle through the winter feed period in a fairly harsh environment. This was a picture that I took in January at a feedlot in Pennsylvania. It was a beautiful sunny day, but it was probably about -10 degrees outside. These calves were on a concrete outdoor lot because that was how they were fed. There is some shelter and a little bit of a bed pack here under the barn, which you can't really see. But the outdoor lot, simply the nature of cattle kind of mucking up an area, gets a little bit wet and muddy. So the question is, and I should have had a polling question to put up, what does mud do to growing calves, right? And I'm sure you've all seen the consequences of mud, but essentially, if we look at the nutrient requirement manual for animals, I'm a nutritionist, so I keep this book on my desk at all times. It's the Beef Cattle NRC, the nutrient requirements for beef cattle, and it goes through and it tabulates for us what the effects are of those harsh environments. And I pulled out just one example, right? If we have animals with a wet matted hair coat in temperatures that are very common in Pennsylvania and New York at minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, what are the consequences to that as we think through that hierarchy of nutrients? Well, we already said the first depot in that hierarchy of nutrient use is going to be maintenance, right? So a wet matted hair coat at minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit doubles the maintenance requirements of cattle, okay? This would be true not just of growing cattle, this would be true of your mature cows as well. And so if you have cows that start to lose condition in the winter months, this may be part of the reason why. Those maintenance requirements the animals need simply to keep its body's metabolism going is doubled if the hair coat is wet and matted at minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a tremendous burden and a tremendous drain on the nutrients that are available then in growing cattle for growth and development as we go forward. I provided this picture. You can see this calf has some matting up on its hair coat, a little bit of wet on its back end. And you can see here, this calf was up under the lean-to structure that it was in, so it was under roof, but you can see bare concrete. It was about minus 20 this day, another lovely January day in central Pennsylvania. And this calf basically did not have adequate bedding. And so what's this calf's priority at this point? Right now, it's trying to just stay alive, right? It's not going to gain for you. It's not going to grow for you. It's not going to meet the goals of your operation because its number one priority in these conditions is to stay alive. So if we flip a little bit and think about the dairy side for just a second, when we talk about those newborn dairy calves, we have excellent research data on nest scores for dairy calves and how to evaluate nest scores for dairy calves and make sure that that calf is completely comfortable so that it can survive and grow optimally and we can decrease mortality rates. We talk very little about that in beef cattle production. We do very little research in beef cattle production on the impact of bedding in a cold environment, for example. And yet we know that it increases maintenance costs. We know that it has an effect. And so when we talk about these harsh environments and managing these cattle in harsh environments, that's the thought I want to leave you with, is that what is this harsh environment going to do to the maintenance costs? If my only goal is keeping those animals alive, then I'm not moving towards a market goal. I'm not moving towards a production goal. If the animal's only goal is staying alive in that cold environment, I'm ultimately not going to be successful. And so we have to move past that and think about making sure that in those cold environments, that animal has adequate bedding, that it's not on a nearly bare concrete floor, that we're scraping pens often enough, even if they're outdoor lots, that wet and that muck isn't kicking up onto the animal's hide and creating a lot of that tag like we saw in these last few pictures. These animals, quite frankly, of all the pictures I've showed you, these animals in the cold snowstorm are probably the most comfortable because you don't see much tag on their hair coat. The snow is starting to build up, but they'll form a buffer there between their hair coat and that snow layer where they'll be able to trap heat and keep warm. And so it's really that wet, muddy matting or fecal material matted up on the hide that's going to cause an issue in those animals when we talk about harsh environments. So when we're in these colder winter months, when we're in harsher environments, we absolutely have to consider bedding as part of our program in order to achieve the benchmark, the goal of getting past just maintenance requirements and being able to move through growth and development in those calves.
Tara?
Yes.
We do have a question in the chat. So for the low temps and the matted hair, does wind have any effect on that also?
Absolutely, absolutely. Particularly if it's wet and matted hair. So, and the NRC has those tables for wind speed calculations as well. I shared with you one example, right, at -10 and a wet matted hair coat, but you can factor in wind. And so, in all of the pictures that I showed you of the growing calves, there was a structure that those calves could get in and out of the wind. This is more important in growing cattle than it is in our mature cows. I see a number of operations in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure it's similar in New York, where a mature cow loafing area would be your winter sacrifice area, and then a round bale would be provided, and those cows will bed up in that round bale if it gets real severe. But in general, our beef cows are pretty hardy, right? Those growing calves, again, because they haven't moved past growth and development, right? That cow has moved past growth and development, is now on to reproduction and fattening. Those growing calves are going to put too much of their maintenance costs to work for them if we don't provide some sort of a windbreak or some sort of a shelter, particularly when it's really, the conditions are really detrimental outside. So define really detrimental, Dr. Felix. If we think about that snowy picture that I showed you, right? The snow is just coming down. It's nice, looks like big, nice, fluffy flakes. And as I mentioned, those cattle are able to create a bit of a temperature barrier, an air barrier there between the hair coat and that snow. If this snow would turn to sleet, as we often get happening in the winter months in the Northeast region, then that sleet would destroy that barrier, essentially start wetting down that hair coat. And so part of what we have to do for those growing cattle, if we don't have a designated indoor area for full-time out of the weather elements, whether it's wind or whether it's sleet, is think about, do we have an area where we can even bring those cattle in, or that we can even provide those cattle in the most extreme of conditions, whether it's wind or whether it's sleet. It's one of the reasons, if you look around the world, right? If you compare cattle feeding in Nebraska to cattle feeding in the Northeast, most of the cattle feeding in Nebraska is in these wonderful big open lots. And the majority of cattle feeding in the United States happens in that Nebraska, Texas, Oklahoma area, because they can have those big open lots and it's very economical to do so. The majority of cattle feeding in the Northeast region happens under roof for this exact reason, because maintenance costs, if we don't provide those cattle areas to get out of the environment or areas to get out of the weather, pretty much destroy all of our value in those animals. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about value and what that means when we talk about nutrition in a little bit. But that's a great question, and providing a windbreak, providing a structure, that's again the reason the majority of cattle in the Northeast are fed in some sort of a structure.
And there was one more in the chat for everybody to see, the compensatory gain, and how does that play into the growth curve? I don't know if you're going to cover that later, or
we are going to get to compensatory gain.
Okay.
I will mention, I talked about growth benchmarks and goals. And when you think about compensatory average daily gain, one of the things I mentioned was that a feedlot doesn't want a calf that's gained 6 pounds during the entire growing period and is going to be fat and dumpy at 1,100 pounds, right? The feedlot, if you're selling those calves to a feeder, they want to be able to capitalize on some of that compensatory gain as well. And so we'll talk a little bit about managed growing strategies and how those change in different scenarios. So we'll get to that. Hold that thought. So how about grouping? If we are going to feed these animals, likely if we're going to feed any number of animals, we're going to feed them in a group. And I chose this particular picture as we think about grouping those animals. One of the things I want us to think of is go back to that hierarchy, right? We've been spending a lot of time talking about the hierarchy of nutrient use and that there's an order and a structure to everything. Well, we all know that animals that are grouped together function within a hierarchy as well. Animal behavior within that pen or within that unit or within that group is dictated by that hierarchy. It doesn't matter how old the calves are. It doesn't matter if they're mature cows. Everybody that has ever been in beef cattle production, raised any cows, always picks out the boss cow, right? She's the boss cow, and it's that she's at the upper echelon of that hierarchy. She is the one that's going to eat first. She's the one that's going to get what she wants, right? So when I think about grouping strategies for growing cattle, my priorities are often to start those calves out on the most equal footing. I know that there is going to be a hierarchy in that pen, regardless of what I do. There's going to be some jostling because that's animal behavior. That's natural animal behavior. I can mitigate some of the energy that's spent on that hierarchy or determining that hierarchy by grouping calves according to their frame size and weight so that there's that more level playing field at the bunk, which again is one of the reasons that I like this picture. If you look down this bunk, there's a fairly uniform set of back ends there. This guy in the middle maybe gets up a little bit more than the guys on the end, but that's why he's in the middle, right? So there's still that hierarchy happening, but because we have specifically grouped, there's 24 pens in this lot, and each pen has 8 or 10 animals in it. So we specifically grouped these animals by body weight in order to alleviate some of that daily jostling at the bunk that's going to occur because of animal behavior. You will still see some slight variation. As I mentioned, smaller animals will get pushed out towards the end, but our goal is that we don't have too much of that going on at the bunk. So this is the other reason why we focus on spacing. And I don't have a lot of slides about spacing, so I'll take just a minute to say, if we are feeding animals in a group, one of the things that we have to ensure is that we have adequate bunk space for all of those animals to get up and eat if they want to, particularly if we're limit feeding those animals, which we'll talk about a little bit later. You can see there's one more calf in this pen that's not up at the bunk, but he could squeeze in here if he really wanted to. So standard recommendations if we're limit feeding growing cattle in particular are about 12 inches per head of bunk space in order to make sure that, again, that we're providing adequate opportunity for all of those calves to get up and eat if they want to. We don't want anybody to have limited intake because of our management, right? And so one of the biggest things I see in indoor facilities in the Northeast is we build these really huge pens, then we build them long and narrow. It's better to have a wider, shorter depth pen with more bunk space than a long, narrow pen, so that we can make sure all those animals can get up and eat at the same time if they want to. So, grouping strategies. What should your grouping strategies be during the winter feed period? It depends, okay? You want to make sure everybody has adequate room to eat, but it depends on what you're feeding and the goals. So the first thing you have to ask yourself, what do I have space available? We talked about competition a little bit at the bunk and that less competition would be better. So we're going to focus on size. But if I've got a lot of different barns that I'm feeding in, I might also want to think about when cattle are coming in and when cattle are going out, and with relation to all those different barns that I might have at the farm. My preference has always been to bring cattle in, to bring cattle into the farm somewhere fairly close to a handling facility, because the odds are you're going to have to treat calves during the winter feeding period. It's part of the nature of living in the Northeast. Good for you if you don't have to treat calves. That's awesome. But if you've got them close to a handling facility, that's going to make your life a whole lot easier bringing them onto the farm. So I say vulnerable animals should get priority spacing. That priority spacing should be close to you, so you don't have to go far to get to them and to check them multiple times a day. It should be protected from the weather, and that goes back to the discussion point we had from the chat about wind. And it should have access to the handling equipment. In addition to space and vulnerable animals, I want to spend a little bit of time on this last point. How are cattle leaving the barn? We're leaving the farm. A lot of times, what happens particularly in smaller feeding operations is we top pens, right? And we send 4 or 5 or 7 or 8 head out of a 35, 50 head pen at a time. And as those cattle leave, we tend to backfill because there's limited space on the farm. One thing I will share with you is that every time you resort those cattle, every time you backfill that pen after topping it, you end up reordering that hierarchy within the pen. And cattle will spend 2, 3, 4 days figuring that hierarchy out again, figuring out who gets to eat first, who gets to drink first, who's the boss in that pen. And that 2, 3, 4, 5 days where they're figuring that out, guess what happens to your nutrient requirements for growth and development? They're too busy focusing on who's the boss and using more energy to maintain their higher status. And they're less focused on gaining. Those calves are less focused on gaining. And so you have this competition pulling away from your growth and development. And you will see it time and time again. Intakes and growth will take a nosedive as you resort those cattle, each time you resort those cattle. In 2 weeks, the pen will sort out and straighten out and intakes will be back up. But every time you go through that cycle of sorting and resorting or adding calves to the pen or pulling calves out, you go through a cycle of redetermining that hierarchy. And that cyclical pattern that starts to occur with intake, that starts to occur with average daily gain as well. And the more cycles we go through, the more times we go through that pattern, the more we lose growth and development, the more we pull away from growth, and the more we're sacrificing in our average daily gains. So as you think about how cattle are going to leave the farm, make your pen sorts early, and as much as possible, try to stick with those pen sorts. If you've got to pull cattle from a pen, can your pen where cattle are leaving the farm be the only pen that you pull cattle from? So you're not resorting the entire farm, so that you're not going through that cycle. Think of management strategies like that so that you can alleviate that cyclical effect of the hierarchy within the pen. All right, we have about 20 minutes left, and it's probably going to take us that long, so I want to leave some time for questions to get through nutritional information and recommended rations. We've covered growth curves and daily benchmarks, management strategies, and grouping strategies. And if you have any questions about anything that I didn't cover, because those are topics that could go on for an hour in and of themselves, just put them into the chat and we'll come back to those at the end. So the harsh reality of what we do in animal ag is that every animal ag industry just about has this issue where 60 to 70% of our input costs or of our operating costs are feed. Okay, it's not necessarily unique to beef cattle. The number changes a little bit depending on whether you go to poultry or swine or dairy, but the reality is for animal ag, the majority of our input costs are, and the majority of our operating costs are feed costs. So it stands to reason then, if we're trying to run a business enterprise, that we should do everything within our power in order to manage our most expensive input, our most expensive operating cost. So anytime we start to think about a nutrition program on the farm, first and foremost, you have to know what you're feeding and what is required, okay? What you're feeding and what is required. If you look at this picture, when I show this in in-person talks, and inevitably I get the response, well, it's corn silage. But if you look more closely, there's no corn kernels in that forage, right? Looks a lot like corn silage, but this is actually corn fodder. It's going to have about half the energy value of corn silage. Just so happens that I chopped it up nice and fine before I fed it, right? So you have to know what it is you're feeding. And this is a funny little example because, of course, on your own farm, you're going to know whether it's corn silage or whether it's going to be corn fodder. But what about the commodities that you purchase? I'll share with you a little story. This is a picture of a feedlot manager that I was chatting with in Brazil. And you can see out that window a lot of white calves. Those are the Nelore cattle that are popular in Brazil. And this was a 70,000 head feedlot. So, and they manage about two turns a year. You can see next to the manager, this is their feed mill operations. So this part over here where you can see the tankers, that's where all their supplements would come in. And then they've got their bunkers over here. They were filling with high moisture corn the day that I was there. And the piece of equipment that he had his hand on right in this picture, he said, this is my most important piece of equipment on this entire 70,000 head farm. This is the piece of equipment that is most crucial to my operation. I'm curious if anybody wants to put in the chat what you guess this piece of equipment was. It wasn't a truck. It wasn't the guys calling the bunk every day. Wasn't the cattle chute. It wasn't even the scale, which is often a talk for a different day. My most important piece of equipment. This is an NIR machine. NIR stands for near infrared reflectroscopy. I can never say that word. Basically, it analyzes feedstuffs in real time. So as trucks were delivering soybean meal to his farm, he was taking samples out of those trucks and running them through this machine in order to test the crude protein value of that soybean meal. He said one particular day he got a delivery of a quantity of soybean meal that would have impacted his entire operation for the next month. And he said, you know, this soybean meal that I got, I ran through the NIR and it had 10% less crude protein than what the company that was selling it to me had claimed. They had diluted the soybean meal. Protein is one of our most expensive nutrients. We'll talk more about protein in a moment. But ultimately, this gentleman had calculated that this particular piece of equipment on that singular occasion saved him about $150,000 in lost gain in that 170,000 or in that 70,000 head feedlot, simply because he tested the feed as it was coming in and knew exactly what he was feeding. Now, most of us across the United States are not operating on this scale. There are some feedlots this size in the United States, but the point is this: you can't manage what you don't measure. And in order to manage nutrition, you have to know what it is that you're feeding. You have to measure the nutrients that are in those feedstuffs that you're using. Many of us are using homegrown forages, for example, in the Northeast. If we don't take a forage analysis, then we're essentially losing money because we're not measuring something that we could be managing if we measured it. So know what it is you're feeding, know how to supply it, and know what it really costs. We're going to talk about each of these things a little bit more. For growing cattle, whether it's during the winter feed period or any other time, your requirements are based on, again, my little green Bible over here, based on size. They're based on your average daily gain. They're based on a number of different factors. And the most important thing to remember about those requirements is that cattle don't care about concentrations, right? As a nutritionist, I'm guilty of this. Every single day, I formulate rations based on 12% crude protein and half a percent of calcium and 0.25% phosphorus, and I balance everything out, and I have these beautiful percentages that the books say, yep, that lines up. but cattle actually eat pounds per day. They eat grams per day. They eat kilograms per day, whichever unit you want to use. They don't eat percents. They don't know about percents. They can't calculate percents. And we absolutely have to pay attention to what that means in terms of what the animals are going to perform, or how the animals are going to perform during that winter feed period. We'll give some examples here in just a minute. So in order to do that, in order to get to that point where we can pay attention to it, we have to know what we're putting in the bunk, plain and simple. I don't care if you take the bathroom scale out of your home bathroom and put the 5-gallon bucket on it to figure out how much your 5-gallon bucket weighs. It can be that simple, but we have to know what's going into that bunk in order to know if we're actually meeting the requirements of that animal. I've had folks take a skid loader full of corn silage and dump it on a truck scale and say, okay, how much does a skid loader full of corn silage weigh? That at least gives you some kind of a benchmark, some kind of an idea of how much you're feeding animals. Of course, ideally, we would all feed on truck scales, but for many of our smaller operations, that's just not the situation. But we absolutely have to have at least an estimate of what we're putting in front of those cattle. So based on pounds per day intake or nutrient intake in grams or pounds, however you want to think about it, that change in intake will impact growth, will impact that first thing we were talking about, growth and benchmarks. So here I have an example, and this is a straight out of the NRC book example. I have a standard kind of an average frame steer weighing about 550 pounds. If I only need that animal to gain 0.4 pounds a day, I don't even want it to gain a half a pound, right? It only has to eat about a pound of crude protein a day. It's 454 grams in a pound. So I can feed a pound of protein, which would be about 2 pounds of soybean meal, right? And I can meet that animal's protein requirements. However, if I actually want that animal to gain 2.6 pounds a day, let alone 3 pounds a day, that crude protein requirement is increased, right? Nearly doubled almost even. Why? Well, if you think about that growth curve, that growth response, that linear growth response that we were seeing was a muscle. Muscle is protein. You can't grow protein without some building blocks, right? And so if we want these animals to grow and to meet those benchmarks that we began this conversation talking about, then we have to give them the groceries to get there. And that's what the rest of this conversation is about. Now that can be challenging, particularly in these younger cattle during the winter feed months, because in a ruminant animal, our ability, or the animal's ability to take in feed, is somewhat limited, right? Here we have this vat, this trash can sized vat in this animal that the only way for nutrients to get out of that vat, there's some absorption across the rumen wall, of course, but in order to get those nutrients to the duodenum, there's a hole, an opening from that big vat, the rumen, that's about the size around of your finger, right? And so point being, if we feed a long stem hay or a forage, for instance, it's going to take a tremendous amount of time for the microbes in that vat to work on that long stem forage and break it down and get it past that opening called the reticulomasal orifice. So I put this graphic up on this slide that shows intake on the y-axis, and on the x-axis it puts digestibility, which I don't love, which is why I add some red to the graph. But basically the point is this: in those forage-fed cattle, the amount of intake that those cattle can physically take in when they are fed a high forage diet is going to be limited. So in your mature cows, for instance, that are eating a forage-based diet, the limitation is about 2% of their body weight on a dry matter basis every day. As we start to incorporate more energy, in this case grain, into that diet, those animals, that grain takes up less space in the rumen, first of all, and it contains more energy per pound than the forage. And so we can start to push past that, that limitation of gut fill and provide more energy, more protein, more nutrients to the animals for growth. That's one of the reasons, one of the primary reasons actually, that we finish cattle in the United States, or the majority of cattle in the United States, on grain, because it takes a really, really high quality grass in order to get past this point where the rumen is limiting intake and capacity, and provide enough nutrients on a forage-based diet for those animals to have adequate growth. It takes really good management of the pastures. And we have a lot of folks in the Northeast that are doing that, but it takes very careful attention. So when we think about this graph and we think about the limitations in young cattle, generally it is that gut fill that limits forage-fed young cattle in their growth. Okay, they just don't have enough physical capacity. If we think about some of the common feedstuffs that we use in growing cattle, corn silage would fall somewhere right around this yellow arrow on this graphic. So corn silage would be getting close to where those animals could kind of start to use more and more nutrients, and we can still get fairly decent growth with corn silage, but the intake of that corn silage is still going to be somewhat limited, simply because the animal's gut isn't big enough, okay, to allow for it to eat everything that it might want. So we're not limiting growth necessarily. The animals fed corn silage based diets are still growing, but they could be growing more. That's the point. And the reason that they can't grow more is because they can't physically eat anymore. So right around the middle of this graphic is where maintenance would fall. Okay, so corn silage, we're pushing a little bit past maintenance, but if we get into something like a poor quality hay, we're going to be just barely meeting maintenance in those growing calves. And this is because those growing calves have a limited dry matter intake. And we're going to talk about everything in dry matter simply because I know there's a variety of moistures that we're putting hay up at, particularly in the last couple of years. We've been kind of all over the map, right? Whether we could even get dry hay. And so we're going to stay focused on dry matter because that's something we can just hold constant. So what this table is showing you is that a 400-pound calf, we would expect that calf on a grower type of ration, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, to be able to consume about 3% of its body weight. Because of that calf size, its gut takes up a greater proportion of its body than frame and other things. And so we would expect about a 3% intake as a percent of body weight. That intake begins to decrease as that calf gets bigger as a proportion of its total body weight, until I mentioned the mature cow is eating about 2% of her body weight on a forage-based diet. Now, if we get into a less forage-dense ration, that's one of the reasons that we shift over to what we call a finisher ration, something with more grain as that animal matures, because then we can continue to maintain that intake instead of see that drop off. So I'm going to focus on these lighter weight calves, again, thinking about that post-weaning period during the winter feed months. And those calves then that are 400 to 500 pounds, just for ease of math, we're going to be feeding them. They're going to be able to consume that 3% of their body weight in dry matter intake. That's only about 12 to 15 pounds of dry matter, right? And you might say, well, my calves are eating more than that or less than that or whatever. That's great. But on average, we're talking about the average calves on an average grower diet. We're focusing on that 12 to 15 pounds. So what does that mean? Well, when we're feeding a grower diet, we're likely down here in the corn silage and orchard grass arena, right? So I use a dry orchard grass hay. Haylage would be a nice quality haylage or baleage would be somewhere between corn silage and orchard grass hay on this benchmark. You don't really have to understand NEG for the purposes of this. The point is just that corn is one of our predominant energy source for livestock feed, and has the majority has more energy than our forage-based diets. Okay. So here's what this means. So if we take a 56 megacal ration, which is standard for a grower ration, then that diet is going to be predominantly corn silage or baleage, whichever, and a little bit of grain, right? Based on the table that I showed you before. If those animals are eating 3% of their body weight, I just calculated out intake for you here, then they're, based on my calculations, they're able to gain very, very well. However, when we first start those new calves out, the majority of us don't get them to eat 3% of their body weight, right? If half of that pen is eating 2% of its body weight, then our average is really going to drop off. Our pen average growth is really going to drop off. And those animals are only able to gain 1 pound a day then. Even if we increase the energy density of the ration to something closer to a finisher ration, but those calves are still only eating 2% of their body weight, gain won't change much, because what's happening is the majority of the feed is being used for maintenance. And those calves that are eating only 2% of their body weight, they've only got about 1 pound of feed left after they meet their maintenance requirements to use for gain. So they're very efficient at converting that, but there's just not that much there in order for them to turn into body weight gain. So that becomes the largest challenge for us when we talk about those pen sorts and things disrupting intake. That can really alter our average daily gain, our averages. So everybody says, Dr. Felix, you've got 7 minutes left on the program and you haven't talked about recommended rations. Why? Because it depends. What are your recommended rations for the winter feeding period? It absolutely depends. No doubt, many of us on this conversation have been watching what commodity prices are doing over the last several days and weeks. And it's not been a pretty sight, right? We are struggling right now with the commodity prices that we're faced with in the beef cattle industry. The reality of it is that what we should be doing, what you should be doing when you decide what ration it is you're going to feed, is pricing the commodities that you have available to you based on the cost per pound of energy, which is what this TDN value is, and the cost per pound of protein, okay? There's a reason we don't feed corn to meet the protein requirements of cattle, because it's not economical to do so, right? There's a reason that we do feed corn for an energy source, because it is, even when it's up at 177 bucks a ton, one of our cheapest energy sources, right? Now, your forage prices may be a little bit different than what's on here. And if you're home raising forages, that'll be very different. Forages are often cheapest, which is why we make heavy use of forages in those growing calves diets. But remember what the goals of your operation are and where you're going to market those calves, and let that dictate what you want your average daily gains to be and how much forage you incorporate into the diet. If you've got calves that are eating really well, they can eat a heavier forage diet and still gain quite well. If you've got calves that are not eating well because of sickness or because of increased pen sorts or because of too much variation in pen in grouping strategies, then you're not going to be pleased with the performance you get out of a high forage diet. So corn silage is very often your cheapest energy source, and that's what that previous slide showed. However, the one thing that I want to leave you with is to keep in mind the fact that every single bite of energy that animal eats is first going to energy to maintenance costs, okay? If you feed corn silage, you're going to take an extra 30 days to get the average daily gain that you might get out of a higher grain-based diet, for example. And what you have to do, I'm not saying that it doesn't pay. Corn silage is one of the greatest feeds we have for growing cattle, but you absolutely have to calculate what that cost in additional days on feed is, and think about that very first point. What are the goals of your operation? Where are you marketing those calves? And let that be your determining factor for how much they need to gain and what they should be being fed. All right, I want to make sure we get to questions in the chat. So my take-home message for you today is to remember that maintenance is the first thing those calves are going to use nutrients for, and that's going to be impacted by environment, that's going to be impacted by hierarchy within the pen, and that's going to be impacted by how much tag are on those cattle, how much wet matted hair coat they have. Last, I want you to remember that nutrition is more about consumption than it is about concentration, and do everything within your power to at least have an estimation of how much feed is going through the bunk to those calves. With that, I would like to take any questions.
So Tara, there are a few in the sidebar here, and I think you have access to read them. It's easier for that to happen.
All right. Where'd we land? Where'd we land, Ben?
So the first one was different sizes at the bunk. If you split up that bunk, would that alleviate the fighting? This farmer has a mixed age of feeders and brood cows, but it's a small scale, only 25 to 30 head, and he uses portable bunks outside.
Yeah, so that's a challenge for a lot of folks that I work with in Pennsylvania. It's a challenge in smaller beef cattle operations. Absolutely, if you can separate the feeders from the brood cows, and you'll see this even in your cow herd. If you've got thin cows and boss cows, if you can do, a couple strands of wire, or if you have an opportunity, if you're feeding in a barn, if you can just put up some portable gates, your thin cows and your feeders will do so much better if they're not competing with those brood cows at the bunk. Those brood cows will really put a hurt on your feeders and even on thinner, younger cows. And anytime we can separate those groups out just a little bit, their performance really tells the full story. We really get a bump in performance in those feeders and those thin cows. So it's hard to do, though. It's hard for a lot of us that are only managing 25, 30 head to do, because that means a little extra work in feeding, and a little extra work in getting water sources to those pens and those kinds of things. But if we can split those, yes, I would.
And then there was a question about, in terms of finishing cattle on shell corn and a high protein pellet. For example, Purina has a pellet, but then there's no forage in
Yep.
that ration.
Yep. So deal with that a lot. Actually, I see that a lot, particularly when we might have a full-time job off the farm, right? Forage is challenging to manage, and particularly wet forages are challenging to keep fresh if we're in a situation where we've got 10 or 20 feeders, right? Keeping that corn silage fresh, even keeping fresh baleage to a group of feeders like that can be a real challenge. And dry hay is expensive right now, if you can find it. So the whole corn and protein pellet can be a great option. It's a more expensive option in the long run, but it's an easier option to manage. It absolutely must be whole corn, though, and here's why. If you remember that reticulo-omasal orifice that I talked about, that's about as big around as your finger, if you put that protein pellet with a ground corn or a cracked corn, that protein pellet in that corn won't stay in the rumen long enough to get the benefit of the microbial digestion that happens there. Whereas if you have a whole corn and a pellet, you can see where the width of my finger, whole kernel kernel is going to have a lot harder time getting through that reticulo-omasal orifice than cracked corn or ground corn, for example. So I think that can be a great option. It does tend to be a little bit more of an expensive option. And as the question pointed out, it's generally a better option for finishing cattle. If you start a 4-weight calf on that, you're going to end up with a calf that's fat by the time it's 1,100 pounds. If that's your market goal, that's fine. But if you start a 7 or an 8-weight calf on that, it's going to be about a 64, 65 megacal ration when we were talking about a 56 or a 60 megacal ration, right? So you're getting a lot more energy into that animal. I saw a question just come in, Ben, about scales and how we tell if the herd is getting enough nutrition. In the cow herd, we typically tell that based on body condition score, Megan. That was part of your question. So if you're not familiar with body condition score, there's a fact sheet on extension.psu.edu with pencil drawing pictures, so you can help you visualize body condition score. In most of our mature cows, we want between a 5 and a 6 body condition score. A 5 would be the last 2 ribs showing, and a 6 would be the ribs just covered, right? So your mature cows, you're maintaining somewhere between there. For your growing cattle, typically the best way to determine if they're getting adequate nutrition is to be recording that average daily gain. Now, in a research setting, we would do that every 14 or 28 days, right, and monitor average daily gain. In a practical setting, that's not ideal. But every time you work those cattle through the chute for processing, or if you're using any kind of implant technologies, which we didn't talk at all about today, or if you've got help every couple of months, you can do a weight check on those animals and calculate your average daily gain based on the weight they were the last time you weighed them and the weight they are this time you weighed them, and get a pretty clear picture of how your nutrition program is helping those calves gain and reach their daily benchmarks.
There was one more about whole corn rather than cracked corn for 5 and 6 weight cattle.
And so am I recommending whole corn rather than cracked corn for 5 and 6 weight cattle? I see that. It depends. So I love whole corn. I think whole corn gets a bad rap. A lot of times folks will say, well, I see whole corn in the manure, so I don't want to feed whole corn. Generally, and in fact, this research was done at Ohio State. They had a poor graduate student that they made sort through the manure, right, and calculate how many corn kernels went into the bunk and how many corn kernels came out the back end. And it was about 2% of the whole corn kernels that went into the bunk actually came out of the animal. If you think about the fact that you're feeding, 15 or 20 pounds of whole corn, a calf is only defecating about 5 pounds a day dry matter, or less, right? And so even though you see those couple of kernels very evident, it's a brown manure patty and they're bright yellow, you might see them very evidently, it's a very small proportion of what's going into the calf. So there's that. There's not as much waste as whole corn gets a bad rap for. And second, though, and why I say it depends is, a lot of us in the Northeast are familiar with both beef and dairy, right? We work a lot in both fields. And we see a lot of ground corn being used in the dairy industry. And the thing we have to remind ourselves is that in the dairy industry, for the duration of that cow's life, we are constantly doing this balancing act between forage for milk fat production and energy for maximum milk production, right? It's this constant balancing act. And so we feed a lot of forage and we very finely grind the corn so we can get every ounce of energy possible out of that corn, because we have to feed a lot of forage to maintain milk fat. In a beef herd, we don't have that same super tightrope that we're walking, right? And so as we increase forage, we can decrease the grind size of that corn grain if we're feeding it in a TMR like we are in a dairy. If we're feeding free choice hay and finely ground corn, what we're opening ourselves up to in the beef world is a recipe for acidosis, because inevitably you will have cattle in that pen that select to eat more forage, and cattle that select to eat more of that ground corn. And the more ground corn they eat without an appropriate mix of forage, the more at risk that animal is for acidosis, because that corn is very rapidly fermenting in the rumen. So whole corn kind of, A, gets a bad rap because we think it's being wasted. B, though, it really helps provide an insurance policy against ruminal acidosis, particularly if we're component feeding. if you're feeding a TMR to 5 or 6 weight cattle, if 50 to 60% of that TMR is forage, then you can grind the corn. And because there's so much forage mixed into that TMR, like there is in a dairy TMR, you won't have an issue with acidosis. But the less forage you include, the coarser the grind on the corn has to be. Okay.
All right. And then we mentioned compensatory gain earlier. I don't know if we do cover it fully or
We didn't. There was too many topics. We could spend another hour, right? So let me just touch on it briefly, Ben. Gain in the feedlot is where the feedlot producer is going to make their money, right? So if we are pushing 4 and 5 and 6 weight cattle along at 4 and 5 pounds, because they can physically do that if we feed a high energy diet, what we're doing is we're pushing them to the physiological maximum of that linear growth curve, right? So we're pushing them as far as they can possibly go. Enter the feedlot. They come into that feedlot. Most feedlot producers expect that those cattle have been on a grower ration where they've been gaining 2.5, 3 pounds a day, right? And so they expect some compensation, compensatory gain when that animal hits the feedlot. They expect that animal in those first couple of months to be able to gain 4 pounds a day, because that will help balance out that growth curve when they're reaching maturity at the end, when they can only physically gain 2 pounds a day, so that they get a nice 3 pound average, right? If we've pushed those calves along so that they're gaining 4 and 5 and 6 pounds, then when they get to the feedlot, they're only going to gain 3 pounds, right? They physically can't gain anymore. And then that becomes, if we're sending them through the feedlot, that becomes our relationship with the feedlot producer and whether or not he's going to buy our calves again, right? Because we've put too much energy into them on the front end. So I shared a 56 mega cow and a 60 mega cow because we were limited on time. But that's where most of our grower rations end up, is somewhere between that 55 and that 58 mega cow NEG, which, like I mentioned, is corn silage, some soybean meal, and corn mostly, because that allows for some compensatory gain when that animal hits the feedlot. That compensatory gain is a little burst of gain that animal gets when it transitions onto a high energy diet.
I'd like to just mention that we are 10 minutes over, and for those of you who need to leave, feel free to do so. Tara, I don't know if you have a couple more minutes. We did have a couple more questions come in.
I'm happy to answer questions, Rich. I don't want anybody to go away with questions.
Okay, great. So if you'll continue with the questions.
Yep. So we had, is there a difference in the rate of passage between beef and dairy when it comes to forages, grains?
Great questions. We know less about this than we should, and I'll say that. From a research standpoint, we know less about this than we should. And now go back to grind size, right? We just talked about grind size for corn. In that dairy animal, we are always trying to push feed through, again, to get as much energy through that animal as we can. And so we're grinding forages, we're finely grinding corn in an effort that distension, or the gut fill that we talked about, is never limiting that dairy cow, right? We don't ever want her to be limited by gut fill. We want her to constantly be able to eat as much as she is willing. And so often rate of passage is a little bit different between beef and dairy, simply because we feed them differently. And that's the most common cause for difference in rate of passage. If you kept all things equal, simply because of how we have selected the dairy cow to be as good of an eater as she can be, you would still expect a little bit faster rate of passage in a dairy cow, simply because of the selection pressure, the genetic selection pressure that's been put on that animal for intake over the course of its life. We've actually genetically selected beef cattle that will gain very efficiently on very little input, right? That's been our selection pressure. We don't want too much intake. So we've selected for very different things in the beef and dairy world, which has caused some divergence among those groups.
And then finally, a farm-specific example, in 5 and 6 weight cattle, recommended cracked corn over whole corn, or vice versa. Getting free choice baleage, by the way.
If they're getting free choice baleage, often I would recommend probably whole corn in that weight of calf over the cracked corn. Again, because the animal is going to select, or different animals within that pen are going to select consuming a different amount of grain and a different amount of haylage. And the one way that you can avoid acidotic upsets or mitigate acidotic upsets is by feeding that whole corn. That's not to say they wouldn't do fine on the cracked corn. And in that particular scenario, what I would probably do as a Pennsylvania extension agent is I would say, can I come and check out your place, right? How's your bunk management? How do the cattle ever run out of the cracked corn such that when they come up to eat it in the morning, they all push the bunk really hard? Because if they do that, then I'd be more likely to recommend whole corn. If you keep a really consistent supply in that bunk throughout the day so that the animals are just kind of constantly picking between the free choice baleage and the corn mix, then it's more likely that you would crack corn could be a safe option for you. There's a note here, whole corn is often cheaper to purchase as well. And that's true. The other thing that I often ask producers to consider, we have a lot of folks that I work with in Pennsylvania that are calling in a grinder to the home farm to grind their corn and their grain mix for them. So they're growing these home raised feeds and then paying someone to come in and grind. And often that cost is anywhere from $20 to $40 a ton to grind the feed. It's not cheap. And even if you have your own grinder, there's a cost to running that grinder, which is usually about $10 a ton if you calculate the energy costs. So when you sit down and you think about whole corn versus cracked corn, we can talk all day about the rumen metabolism and the health of those animals, the gut health of those animals. But at the end of the day, one of the biggest factors is cost, and penciling the cost for processed corn versus a whole corn is a really good place to start.